Picture this. You're standing at the edge of a forest, about 300,000 years ago. The sun is going down. You've been tracking a herd of horses all day with three other members of your group, and you've finally cornered one near a rocky outcrop. This is it. This is the moment. You need to coordinate. You need to tell the person to your left to move forward, the person to your right to hold their position, and the person behind you to get ready to throw. But you can't talk. You gesture. You grunt. You point. You hope, genuinely hope, that the three people with you understand what you mean, because if they don't, the horse bolts, you all go hungry, and someone might get hurt trying to chase it down in the dark. The entire outcome of this hunt, and potentially the survival of your group through the coming winter, depends on how well you can communicate something that a modern human would express in about 4 words. Now. Go. Stop. Ready. This is the world before language. And honestly, it sounds exhausting. Which brings us to the question that has genuinely tormented linguists, anthropologists, archaeologists, and evolutionary biologists for decades. When did ancient humans actually start talking? When did those grunts and gestures turn into something we'd recognize as real language? And what does the answer tell us about who ancient humans really were? Because here's the thing. This is one of the hardest questions in all of science. Not because we don't have evidence. We actually have more evidence than most people realize. But because language, like clothing, doesn't fossilize. You can't dig up a conversation, you can't carbon date a sentence. And yet, through an incredibly creative combination of genetics, anatomy, archaeology, and neuroscience, researchers have pieced together a picture of ancient language origins that is both surprising and deeply compelling. Let's get into it. First, let's define what we're actually asking. When we say talking, we don't mean simple vocalizations. Every animal makes sounds. Wolves howl. Chimpanzees scream and chatter. Birds sing incredibly complex songs. Even bees communicate in their own way through a dance that encodes distance and direction of food sources. None of that is language. Language, in the full sense of the word, has specific properties that make it qualitatively different from any other communication system on Earth. Linguists call these properties design features, and they include things like displacement, the ability to talk about things that are not present in time or space, like there's a predator in the valley to the east, or next winter will be hard. Productivity, the ability to combine a finite number of elements into an infinite number of novel sentences. And recursion, the ability to embed ideas within ideas, like, I think that she believes that he knows where the herd went. These properties don't just require a voice, they require a specific type of mind, a mind that can represent abstract concepts, model other minds, plan across time, and manipulate symbols. And that's what makes the question of when ancient humans started talking so much more interesting than it might initially seem. We're not just asking about sound production, we're asking about the emergence of a cognitive revolution. So what does the anatomy tell us? Let's start with the vocal tract, because this is where most people expect the story to begin. Human speech requires a very specific configuration of the throat and mouth. In most mammals, including our closest relatives, the chimpanzees and bonobos, the larynx, the voice box, sits high in the throat. This is actually useful for them. It allows them to breathe and swallow at the same time without choking. Handy if you're eating and need to stay alert for predators. But in adult humans, the larynx sits much lower in the throat. This creates what's called the pharyngeal cavity. It's a resonating chamber above the vocal cords that allows us to produce the full range of vowel sounds that make speech so flexible and information-dense. We traded the ability to drink and breathe simultaneously, which is why humans can choke on food in a way that chimps basically can't, for the ability to talk. The problem with studying this in ancient humans is that the larynx is made of soft tissue. It doesn't fossilize. We can't look at an ancient skull and see where the larynx was positioned. What we can do, however, is look at the base of the skull, specifically a feature called the basic cranium, and make inferences about laryngeal position based on the degree of curvature. Here's what that tells us. In ancient Homo sapiens, skulls going back about 300,000 years, the basic cranial flexion is broadly modern, meaning the vocal tract anatomy needed for speech was potentially in place very early in our species' history. Earlier Homo species like Homo erectus show a less flexed basicranium, suggesting their vocal anatomy may have been intermediate, capable of more complex vocalizations than other primates, but perhaps not the full range of modern speech. But, and this is a big but, anatomy is only part of the picture. Having the physical equipment doesn't automatically mean you're using it for language. The question of when the brain was ready for language is equally important. Let's talk about the brain for a moment, because this is where things get really fascinating. The human brain has a region called Broca's area, located in the left frontal lobe, which is critical for speech production. It's also involved in processing grammatical structure and coordinating the complex motor sequences required for articulate speech. Without a functioning Broca's area, you cannot produce fluent language. Now, brains don't fossilize either, but skulls do. And the inside of a skull preserves something called an endocast, essentially a natural mold of the brain's outer surface. From endocasts, researchers can measure the size and shape of ancient brains and, with significant caveats, make inferences about which regions were developed. Here's what the endocasts tell us. Reorganization of the brain toward a more modern, language-ready configuration appears to have been happening in ancient Homo sapiens and possibly even in earlier Homo species. The expansion of the parietal region, associated with symbolic thinking and language, and the development of asymmetry between the left and right hemispheres, associated with language lateralization, both show up in the fossil record well before the archaeological record gives us clear evidence of complex symbolic behavior. The brain, in other words, may have been ready for language long before we see unambiguous evidence of language being used. And then there's genetics. In 1998, a family in London, known in the scientific literature as the KE family, was identified as having a mutation in a gene called FOXP2. This mutation caused severe difficulties with speech production and language comprehension across 3 generations of the family. It became the first specific gene linked to human language. FOXP2 isn't a language gene in any simple sense. That's a significant oversimplification. But it does appear to be critical for the fine motor control of the vocal tract and for certain aspects of language processing. When researchers analyzed the version of FOXP2 found in modern humans and compared it to versions found in other primates, they found that the human version had undergone significant changes that appear to have been strongly selected for at some point in our evolutionary history. The really dramatic moment came in 2007, when researchers successfully recovered FOXP2 from Neanderthal DNA extracted from bones found at El Cedron Cave in Spain. And what they found was striking. Neanderthals carried the same modern human version of FOXP2, not a chimp version, not an intermediate version, the same version that you and I carry right now. This was enormous news. It suggested that the neurological and motor infrastructure for language was present in Neanderthals, who diverged from our lineage somewhere between 500,000 and 700,000 years ago, which pushes the potential origin of at least some of the biological underpinnings of language back further than many researchers had expected. Now, FOXP2 alone does not tell us that Neanderthals had full modern language. It tells us they had a piece of the biological puzzle, but it's a significant piece, and it fits with a growing body of evidence that Neanderthals were far more cognitively sophisticated than the old caricature suggests. Let's step back from the biology for a moment and think about the archaeological evidence, because this is where the story gets genuinely exciting. If ancient humans had language, real, symbolic, complex language, we would expect to see evidence of symbolic thinking in the archaeological record. Things like deliberate use of pigments, making of ornaments, creation of art, long-distance exchange of materials, complex burial practices. These behaviors all require the ability to represent and communicate abstract concepts. They're the fingerprints of a mind that can handle symbols. So, when do we first see them? The answer has been pushed back dramatically over the past 2 decades of archaeological discovery. At Blombos Cave in South Africa, researchers found pieces of red ochre engraved with geometric patterns, dating to approximately 75,000 to 100,000 years ago. These are not accidental scratches. These are deliberate, repeated geometric designs, crosshatch patterns that required planning, execution, and presumably some kind of meaning within the social group that created them. At the same site and others nearby, they found perforated shells, tiny, carefully pierced snail shells that were almost certainly strung together as beads and worn as personal ornaments. The shells had been brought from the coast, sometimes distances of many kilometers, suggesting both intentional collection and possibly trade or exchange. In Morocco, at a site called Bismoon Cave, even older shell beads were found in 2021, dating to between 142,000 and 150,000 years ago. 150,000 years ago, ancient humans were making and wearing jewelry. Now here's the connection to language. These behaviors, deliberate geometric design, personal ornamentation, long-distance material exchange, all require a shared symbolic system to be meaningful. A bead is just a perforated shell unless it means something to both the person wearing it and the people seeing it. The geometric designs on ochre are just scratches unless they represent something that other members of your group understand and recognize. Shared symbolic systems require shared communication systems. Shared communication systems require language. Let's go even further back, because the evidence keeps getting pushed earlier and earlier. At a site in Zambia called Kabwe, also known as Broken Hill, a skull was found that dates to somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 years ago. The individual had a middle ear anatomy that is essentially indistinguishable from that of modern humans. This is significant because the middle ear is tuned, in modern humans, to be especially sensitive to the frequency range of speech sounds. Our ear anatomy is specifically calibrated for listening to the kind of sounds that language produces. If the hearing anatomy of Homo heidelbergensis, the species this skull likely belongs to, was already tuned to speech frequencies 300,000 to 500,000 years ago, that's a remarkable hint that something language-like may have been in use much earlier than our most conservative estimates. Similarly, a study published in 2021 examining the hyoid bone, the small, horseshoe-shaped bone at the base of the tongue that anchors the muscles used in speech, from Neanderthal specimens, found that Neanderthal hyoids were virtually identical in shape, size, and mechanical properties to those of modern humans. The hyoid bone plays a critical role in the complex tongue movements required for articulate speech. If Neanderthals had the same hyoid anatomy we do, they likely had the same range of tongue movements we do. The anatomy keeps saying, these people could talk. But there's a counter-argument that's worth taking seriously, because good thinking requires engaging with the best version of the opposing view. The counter-argument goes something like this. Just because ancient humans had the physical and neurological equipment for language doesn't mean they actually had language in the full modern sense. Evolution provides hardware, culture develops software, and the archaeological record for a very long time doesn't show the kind of behavioral complexity that we'd expect from a population with full modern language. For most of the period from 300,000 to about 100,000 years ago, the stone tool technology used by ancient humans was relatively conservative. The same basic tool types, hand axes, scrapers, basic flakes, were made in pretty much the same way for hundreds of thousands of years, with relatively little innovation. This is sometimes called the behavioral conservatism of early ancient humans, and it seems puzzling if these populations had fully modern language. If you can tell someone, try it this way, make the flake thinner, use a softer hammer, then surely you'd expect more rapid technological innovation over time. And yet for much of the deep past, innovation happened slowly. Glacially slowly, you might say. This is a fair point, and it suggests that even if the hardware for language was present early, the full deployment of language as a driver of cultural innovation may have come later, potentially tied to changes in social group size, environmental pressure, or some threshold in population density that allowed ideas to spread and accumulate faster. Here's a fascinating idea that addresses exactly this tension: the social brain hypothesis and its connection to language. The anthropologist Robin Dunbar proposed that the size of the neocortex in primates, the outer layer of the brain associated with higher cognitive functions, scales with the typical social group size of the species. Larger social groups require more complex social cognition, keeping track of more relationships, more alliances, more potential conflicts. And he argued that language, in early humans, evolved primarily as a form of social bonding. Essentially, as a more efficient replacement for the physical grooming that other primates use to maintain social relationships. Grooming works, but it's slow. You can only groom one individual at a time. Language allows you to groom multiple people simultaneously, to share gossip, reinforce social bonds, establish trust, and navigate the complexities of group life at a scale that physical grooming simply cannot match. Under this hypothesis, language didn't emerge primarily because we needed to coordinate hunts or share technical knowledge, though it ended up serving those functions brilliantly. It emerged because we lived in increasingly large and complex social groups, and we needed a way to manage those relationships at scale. This is a deeply interesting idea because it frames language as fundamentally social technology, not just practical technology. And it fits with what we know about the social complexity of ancient humans, the long-distance trade networks, the exchange of ornaments, the apparent maintenance of relationships across large territories that we see in the archaeological record. Let's talk about a specific piece of evidence that I think is criminally underappreciated when people discuss ancient language. Around 40,000 years ago, in caves across Europe, ancient humans started making art. Not just any art, extraordinary art. The paintings in Chauvet Cave in France, dating to around 36,000 years ago, depict animals with a mastery of perspective, movement, and anatomical detail that genuinely shocks modern viewers. These aren't crude scrawls. These are paintings that capture the way a rhinoceros horn catches the light, the way a pride of lions moves as a group, the dynamic tension of a charging aurochs. But here's what I want you to focus on. The Chauvet paintings were made deep inside caves, not near the entrance where light came in naturally. Deep inside, in chambers that required torches to reach and illuminate. These were not casual doodles. These were deliberate, intentional, socially meaningful acts performed in specific locations, almost certainly in the context of communal ritual or ceremony. To organize a communal ritual, you need language. To assign meaning to a specific cave chamber. To agree on what the paintings represent, to share the knowledge of where these places are and what you do there, all of that requires not just vocalizations, but complex symbolic communication. The art is not just art. It's evidence of a fully operational symbolic culture, which is evidence of fully operational language. And when you push back even further, back past 40,000 years, back through the ochre engravings at Blombos, back through the shell beads at Bismuth, the evidence for symbolic culture keeps appearing, keeps pushing the origin of language earlier, keeps filling in the picture of a species that was talking in some meaningful sense for much longer than we used to believe. There's one more angle I want to explore, and it's perhaps the most profound. The question of when ancient humans started talking is also, in a sense, the question of when ancient humans started being human in the deepest possible sense. Because language is not just a communication tool. Language is the medium through which humans construct reality. Think about what language does for you beyond the purely practical. Language allows you to tell stories, to encode the past, to pass it down, to learn from people who died before you were born. Language allows you to imagine hypothetical futures. What if we tried this? And to explore possibilities without having to physically enact every option. Language allows you to create shared fictions, values, social norms, beliefs, identities that bind large groups of unrelated individuals together into functional communities. No other animal on Earth can do any of these things in the way we do. The wolf pack coordinates a hunt, yes. The chimp uses tools and teaches others. But no wolf has ever told a younger wolf about the great hunt of 3 winters ago, drawing lessons from it. No chimp has ever constructed a system of shared beliefs that allows 100 unrelated individuals to cooperate toward a common goal they've never explicitly negotiated. These things, stories, hypothetical thinking, shared fiction, are uniquely human. And they all require language. So when we ask, when did ancient humans start talking? We're really asking, when did these uniquely human capacities first emerge? When did the world first have creatures in it who could tell stories, imagine futures, and build shared reality through words? And the honest answer is earlier than you think. The most conservative scientific estimates for the emergence of some form of language, based on the combination of anatomical, genetic, and archaeological evidence we've discussed, hover around 100,000 to 200,000 years ago for modern Homo sapiens. But some researchers looking at the cumulative evidence from hyoid bones, basic cranial flexion, ear anatomy, FOXP2 genetics, and the social complexity implied by ancient material culture push that date back toward 500,000 years ago or more, into the era of Homo heidelbergensis, the common ancestor of both Neanderthals and modern humans. Others argue for a language-ready biology going back even further, possibly 700,000 years, with language itself developing gradually. Proto-language first, perhaps gesture-heavy and limited in syntax, then expanding over generations into the full recursive symbolic system we use today. The truth, almost certainly, is that language didn't appear in a single dramatic moment of invention. There was no day when some ancient human woke up, opened their mouth, and became the first person to ever utter a grammatical sentence. Language almost certainly evolved gradually, accumulating complexity over hundreds of thousands of years in a process that was deeply intertwined with the evolution of our brains, our social lives, our material culture, and our biology. And that gradual emergence is, in many ways, more astonishing than a sudden invention would be. It means that for perhaps hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors were engaged in a slow, continuous project of developing the most powerful communication system on Earth. Not because anyone planned it, not because anyone understood what they were building, but because in each generation, those who could communicate a little better, coordinate a little more effectively, tell slightly more compelling stories about slightly more abstract ideas, those individuals did better. They survived more. They reproduced more. They passed on their capacities to the next generation. Language is an evolutionary achievement of staggering proportions, and it was built slowly and cumulatively by ancient humans doing nothing more dramatic than trying to be understood. Let's come back to that forest clearing from the beginning. You're standing there, watching the horse, gesturing to your companions. But now, knowing what we know about the evidence for ancient language, let's complicate that scene a little. Maybe those gestures aren't random. Maybe they're part of a system, a proto-language, gesture-rich and context-dependent, but a system nonetheless, one that the four of you have developed and refined over years of hunting together. Maybe there are sounds too, specific calls that mean specific things, not random grunts, but structured vocalizations with consistent meaning. Maybe the person to your left is the one who, last night around the fire, told the story of a hunt she went on as a child, where a horse was driven into a gully from the right flank. And because of that story, communicated in whatever proto-language existed. In that moment, everyone knows what to do right now because you all heard the story, you all understood it. You all filed it away as useful knowledge about horse behavior and hunting tactics. That's language doing its most fundamental work. Not in some grand philosophical sense. Not in poetry or philosophy. Just one person's experience, encoded in communication, transmitted across time and space, shaping the behavior of others who weren't there. That is the magic trick. That is what language does. And ancient humans, in their own way, with their own system at whatever stage it had reached, were doing it.